welcome to a conversation with Sam Greenhouse. I'm John Lakeen, Director of the Biostatistics Center and Professor of Statistics at the George Washington University. Joining us today is Mitchell Gale, Chief of the Biostatistics Branch of the Division of Cancer Epidemiology and Genetics of the National Cancer Institute at the National Institutes of Health. Sam was born in January of 1918 in the Bronx. He received his bachelor's degree in mathematics from the City College of New York in 1938, and a master's degree in 1954 and a PhD in 1959, both from the George Washington University. After receiving his BS, he moved to Washington, where he began his career in the Bureau of Census under Edward Deming. In 1948, he was recruited by Harold Dorn to join the initial group of 6 statisticians who formed the first statistics unit of the National Institutes of Health. He later served with the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, where he rose to the position of Associate Director for Epidemiology and Biostatistics. Sam's affiliation with the George Washington University dates to 1946, when he was appointed professorial lecturer in the Department of Statistics, concurrent with his pursuit of his own graduate degrees. Upon his retirement from the National Institutes of Health in 1974, Sam was named Professor of Statistics and later served as department chair. He is now Emeritus Professor and Associate Director for Research Development of the Biostatistics Center in the Department of Statistics at George Washington University. Sam has received virtually every award granted to a distinguished member of the profession, including the prestigious Founders Award from the American Statistical Association in 1993. Today, Mitch and I hope to discuss with Sam his perspectives on the role of biostatistics and to reflect on his substantial body of methodological research, which includes his 1959 citation classic by Greenhouse and Geiser on methods in the analysis of profile data. Sam, perhaps we could start by asking you to describe your early training in mathematics and statistics.
Yes, thank you, John. My early training, of course, came at the City College of New York, as you indicated, where I majored in mathematics. And one of the memorable things at City College was my having as an instructor M.O. Post, very famous logician. He taught the theory of functions of a real variable, in which we used the textbook by Townsend, and his notes were more voluminous than the text. M.O. Post actually had Gödel's theorem in the middle 20s, but he didn't publish because he thought there was something lacking. I went on for my graduate training after I came to Washington at the George Washington University. At that time, I registered for the master's degree and Doctor of Philosophy with Weider, Professor Weider, who himself was very interesting, being a student of Craig's at Iowa. Weider actually went to the president and asked to form a Department of Statistics, which turned out to be the first Department of Statistics in the United States in a liberal arts and science college. My training for the dissertation and PhD preparation was under, of course, Saul Kulbach. Everybody knows Cully. And the dissertation was on information theory and the problem of discrimination with unequal covariance matrix in the 2 multivariate normal distributions.
Well, what brought you to Washington in the first place? And why don't you tell us a little bit about your early career?
The thing that brought me to Washington was the availability of a job in the Census Bureau. There was a very major examination in 1938 and 39. It was by the Civil Service and was called the Junior Professional Assistant. And in those days, of course, getting a job was very difficult. In fact, when I got out of City College, I had tried to become a teacher in the New York City schools, but unfortunately, I flunked my very first flunk of a speech examination because I had a hissing S and a sibilant T. Now, as I later found out, this may have been the best thing that ever happened to me, to fail and only fail on that particular occasion. So that I took this examination to look for a job, passed it, and got a job at the Census Bureau with Ed Deming's group. That's what led me to come to Washington.
Tell us a little bit more about Ed Deming's group, because I
Yes.
understand that was a really exciting group to work with.
Yes, it was a very exciting. They actually, very few people realize that this was the initiation of sampling of office techniques, sampling procedures that we use in office. Our specific task, with Ben Tepping as charge of the section, was to sample the punch card operators in the Census Bureau. There were thousands of them. And we sampled every 20th punch card operator on the basis of that punch card operator's performance in the past. Of high performance actually indicated that this person could be sampled. And this was the first time this was ever done. It was a very interesting operation. But in addition, what happened here was that Jack Lieberman, who later joined up with me at NIH, Jack and I also was asked to edit Ed Deming's very first book on the statistical adjustment of data. And it was a very interesting time because, if you recall, that was the period in which Hansen and Hurwitz had gotten together to write their voluminous 2-volume book on survey sampling.
And then you joined Harold Dorn's group. Is that right? You moved to the NIH a little about this time? Or what happened?
After Census, I went into the Army from the Census Bureau, hoping to come back to Deming's group when I got out of the Army, if I ever got out. But that didn't happen. I did get out, but I went to work for UNRRA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, where I was a statistical analyst. When that job was up, I then it's very interesting, I just can't recall exactly what made me go out there, but this was a group that we in Washington proper, living in the District of Columbia, knew existed out past Bethesda, and at that point there must have been a sort of farmland, and there was a group called a research group in medicine. And somebody gave me the name of Dr. Harold Dorn. I called him and he said, "Why don't you come out here and we'll have a talk." I did that, got the job, and went to work for Jerry Cornfield, who was head of a group. In that group at that time was Nathan Mantell, Marvin Schneiderman, Jack Lieberman, and myself.
And did the people in this group have a particular influence on the way you thought about problems or approached
this
research?
is a very fascinating evolution of statistics. Nobody in this group was a biostatistician or considered himself to be a biostatistician. There were 3 members who were trained in mathematics. Cornfield himself had an undergraduate major in history, and in fact he had some graduate work in history at Columbia University. But he had some kind of an intuitive genius for quantitative thinking, quantitative concepts. And the idea at that time was statistics as methodology in aid of the laboratory people for whatever quantitative questions they might have. At no time was there the concept of biostatistics. This came in later, even though our units were consequently in the various institutes called biometry, which is the application of mathematics to these to biological systems. Biostatistics was used principally for the application of statistics to biomedical problems, and I suspect that this became prevalent when the biostatistics departments in School of Public Health became very predominant and people started going to those schools to get training. But I must say also that even when Jerry, in an academic area, when he was chairman of the Department of Statistics in 1974 and 75, he had a reluctance to talk about a biostatistics major. He wanted people to be trained in statistics, and he thought that the options could be in economics, could be in survey sampling, could be in statistics or any other field, psychology and so on. But the concept of a biostatistician was a little foreign to him, and it was foreign to us until with the annual meetings we began hearing people pointing us out as the biostatisticians instead of the statisticians, so that became ingrained. We were lost.
So you actually thought of yourselves predominantly as statisticians
Yes.
from the beginning?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
And did other people in this group, you mentioned Jerry's intuition, were there any other people in this group that influenced the way you thought about problems?
Oh yes, very much so. One of my first papers was with a guy named Nathan Mantell. we did this work on diagnostic testing. Now, Mantell was a genius in his own right. He differed from Jerry, although both of them were intuitive. They saw answers and then tried to get the demonstrations for proofs for those answers. Usually they turned out to be correct. But Mantell was more of an analyst, as opposed to Cornfield, who was able to synthesize ideas to actually come up with theories. Mantell was unusual in his ability to size up a problem under consultation, look at the data, get the questions, and very quickly, in fact, he prided himself on the speed in which he would be able to choose the appropriate procedure to analyze the data.
I'm familiar with one of your papers with Mantell on diagnostic tests, and it had some very interesting results. The first results I'd ever seen about estimating the variance of a sensitivity estimate when you have to also estimate the cut point that gives you the specified specificity. But there were some other interesting features of that work. Is there anything else you'd like to say about that paper?
Yes. This work, when we, in our unit, it was very strange in which we actually did our work. There were assignments which was made sometimes by Cornfield, sometimes by Harold Dorn. But in many instances, a telephone would ring by a laboratory investigator who would ask for some statistical help. The one who answered the phone was the one who became that fellow's statistical consultant. Now, actually, I was assigned by Dr. Dorn to the Cancer Control Unit. Cancer Control Unit, in some sense, had some kind of a motivation to sponsor diagnostic tests, which in that period was running rampant. Usually, they came, as we used to say, at the time the American Cancer Association was looking for funds, and then they would announce about breakthrough in diagnostic tests for cancer. Now, there was a man named Hutchins of Chicago, whom you probably know, Mitch, who had developed a diagnostic test, serum diagnostic test with measurement of iodine acetate. And this raised some interesting questions because it was a continuous variable. Now, the way you would do this diagnosis under the controlled conditions that we would be talking about would have a group of diseased individuals and a group of normal individuals who didn't have cancer, and measure this particular variable on every individual in both groups. This still did not become a diagnostic procedure until one said there was a cutoff point beyond which, for example, we might say anyone with this measure has a high probability of risk for cancer or has cancer. Below it, low probability. So that this led to the development of a process which I essentially borrowed from type 1, type 2 errors. Because in the diagnostic test, the type 1 error might be the false positive, the type 2 error might be the false negative. So what you wanted to do is to find a cutoff point which would minimize the type 1 error, type 2 error for a given type 1 error. That's led to the Greenhouse-Mantell paper.
And you did some other work with Mantell, I recall, too, trying to perfect treatments for leukemia using mouse models, trying to reduce the toxicity from aminopterin.
Yeah.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about that work
Yes.
and the role of statistics in the interpretation of those data?
There was a biologist in the Cancer Institute named Abe Golden who worked in Baltimore in the old building which was essentially the basis for the original law for maritime medical help. That is, people who were in the Navy in the 1800s had to have medical help, and they came to this building for it. And Abe had a lab, a big lab in a basement where he would be working with mice, particularly leukemia L1210. He would inject 1 million cells into an animal in a thigh. Tumor would develop, and in about 8-9 days, or 8-9-10 days, almost all animals would die. So what he was trying to do was to find some kind of an agent which would prolong the survival of these animals, and there was something called aminopterin, amethopterin. However, these agents were also toxic to the host. So in addition to having problems with the tumor, the animal would have toxicity problems as a result of the injurious effects of the agent. So Golden had a problem as to how to handle both the toxicity, and the efficacy of the agent against the tumor, so that he called for statistical help. I was the one who answered the phone, so I became the consultant. Now, I was able to handle many things that came up in the usual sense of probing analysis. But then when we had to take care of both the toxicity against the host and the efficacy against the tumor, I went to Nathan, because at that time Nathan had already worked with Jerry in publishing this major article on probate analysis, which was a major contribution to the field. And Nathan and I used to go up to Baltimore once a week. And what Nathan did to handle this was to devise what he called the probate plane, which took account of both the toxicity of the agent and the effect of the agent on a tumor in terms of prolongation. So that he was able to, that is Golden, had the following problem, which is of interest in its own right and became a model for biologists. If there were 10 doses, and there were, let's see, there were 16 doses of both combined aminopterin and the saving factor, the citravorin factor, CF, which led to 32 dose combinations. 10 animals on each dose was 320 animals, which had to be randomized. We insisted it had to be randomized. He was able to do this by tagging the ear of the animal in some sense in different ways with different codes, and he performed the randomization of these 20 animals between 9 and 11 o'clock in the morning in 2 hours. We still don't believe he was able to do it, but he did. And this was our contribution, and it was a major contribution to bioassay in this particular kind of work. Golden became very famous subsequently.
Able to analyze both factors at the same time.
At the same time,
right.
And so that one could say what would be the effect on to what would be the increased survival time given a 5% toxicity, or given that you had a 20% toxicity. And toxicity could be distinguished because the animals usually died on day 7, 8, and those survival went up to about 18, 20.
Now, Sam, in 1958 and 59, you and Seymour Geiser published your classic papers on profile analysis. What was the impetus to that work, and why did you call it profile analysis?
Good. This came about from our consultations with psychologists. And psychologists, you know, give battery of tests. And in some instances where they're working with groups, let's say abnormal groups or retarded groups or slow learners, and then compare with normal, they would try to give various tests, like a reading test, a quantitative test, and then they would repeat that so that they had the question as to how would you analyze these data to determine whether the treatment, whatever treatment they were using or whatever conditioning they were using, usually in psychology was stimuli and conditioning, led to improvements or not. And this, the profile idea came from educators who have marks for their students on a Stanine scale from 1 to 9. And so, for example, they can have a reading value for an individual of 6, a reading value for that same individual for arithmetic of an 8, and so on. And they call this a profile for that student. I adapted that term. Seymour already had prepared the way for this by doing something with extending box on his quadratic form distributions, because that's what we were working with. We were working with actually quadratic distributions in normal variables, we assumed. And what we did was to find the mean vector for one group versus the mean vector for another group. Order didn't have anything to do with this. It didn't make any difference whether we put reading first or reading second. And that led to the concept of a profile analysis. And it was based essentially by approximating the F distribution with a correction factor for degrees of freedom.
When the assumption of compound symmetry.
When the assumption for the analysis of variance of lack of heteroscedasticity, that is, when they were, observations were correlated unequally.
Right.
If they're correlated uniformly, then the F distribution still applies, obviously.
Right. Now, I remember Max Halperin often talking about what he called the NIH model as a way of analyzing longitudinal data. And if you look in the literature, it's difficult to find anything about the NIH model. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. Many of our consultations with people in the laboratory were with investigators who were working with, let's say, 3 dogs, or 5 guinea pigs, or 6 animals of a different variety. They took multiple observations over time. Now, the concepts at that time for analysis was to look at the entire assemblage and consider it as a multiple distribution of whatever kind, multi-normal or multi-whatever. And this is very difficult to do, especially back in the 50s when computers were not available to us. What we decided to do at the NIH, and who did it, Lord knows, was to look at each individual, assume a model of growth or of change over time, let's call it a pattern, and fit some kind of an arbitrary curve to it. Whether it was linear over time, even though it was not exactly linear, would fit our purposes. But whatever it was, that curve offered a reduction in data because it only gave an intercept and a B0, B1, or B2. Now we had that for each individual, and therefore was able to actually get a mean of these coefficients for group 1 against the mean vector of group 2, and then determine if they differed. That was an easy test. It was a Hoteling's t-square. We were also able to determine whether any of the variables, any of the factors in the profile contributed to the variation between the 2 groups. And that led to the profile analysis paper, and of course that was preceded by Geisser's lead in taking the paper and extending Box's procedure, which appeared, a paper which appeared in the Annals.
I read that you worked with Jerry Kornfield and Jesse Steinfeld on the analysis of radioactive tracer experiments. By the way, was this the same Steinfeld that later became the Surgeon General?
Jesse Steinfeld became a Surgeon General later, after he was in the Cancer Institute for a while, yes. This was work in compartmental kinetics, where one, in a simplification of trying to determine the metabolism of some hormone or some enzyme or some agent, protein for example, protein metabolism, you postulated certain compartments in the body in which, for example, there would be an input with a rate constant of this agent, and then there was an output from this compartment into another compartment, and you could go on and postulate as many compartments as you thought was realistic, but the more you did, the more difficult it would become to analyze. So essentially we said, let's do a 2-compartment system, one where the agent comes in, 2, a compartment where the agent is metabolized to some other important need for the body, and then the outgo, that is through the return through the bladder out of the system. And this led to a deterministic model, which was essentially governed by differential equations. And the differential equation was a function, there were as many as there were constants that you put into the system, and then the solution of this was a sum of exponentials. This was a problem that many people had worked on, particularly Ho Hartley, and our procedure was first to, by eye, plot what was going on, peel off the fastest exponential, get an estimate of the rate by eye from the graph, and that became the first rate constant and the fastest governing exponential, in which led to metabolism. And then we would deal with one, we'd have another exponential left, and estimate the parameters. Had some very interesting problems of non-identifiability, because when you have a sum of 2 exponentials, if you have A1 lambda 1, A2 lambda 2, they're interchangeable, so you don't know which one comes first. And that causes some little difficulties mathematically. But that was the origin of that problem, and that was the solution. And actually, it was used. Steinfeld had a laboratory in the Cancer Institute, of course, and there were people working there. One, I think, was named Patrick Leahy, who used this procedure. But essentially, there was a mathematician named Moniz Berman who came into the National Institute of Arthritis and Metabolic Diseases. And he had a program package of doing this and a lot of other things, which many of the investigators took over.
Sam, in 1966, there was an article in the Journal of Chronic Diseases that published a symposium. Basically, I think that was chaired by Sid Cutler, and you were one of the first speakers in that symposium. And in your remarks, you were somewhat skeptical about a role for formal hypothesis testing in clinical trials. Do you still feel that way?
Yes, very much so. In fact, maybe more so than even then. I consider this to be, from the point of view of the people at NIH, a sort of an evolution into a different level of statistical thinking and statistical practice. Because remember, up to that point, we were governed by Neyman Pearson kind of thinking with type 1, type 2 error, that you weren't supposed to interfere with an experiment because you might upset the pre-specified alphas and betas that you had determined, and therefore nothing was to be done. You weren't supposed to look at the data because it might influence the alpha and beta. But when we came up to clinical trials, not with animals but with humans, some of these strictures had to be relaxed. We couldn't just let this process go without finding out, for example, if there were any toxic effects. So we had to look at the data. Now, when you look at the data, you might find that one treatment in a year is overwhelmingly superior to the other treatment. Does that mean that you keep on going and let the people who are on the inferior treatment go on? That would be, in a sense, unethical. So that we were led very quickly at the very beginnings, in the early thinking of clinical trials at the NIH, to determine that we could not go on that way, that there had to be some relaxation, there had to be something more than just alpha and beta. Now, the position I took then, of course, this position now is quite common now with all of the modelers and Bayesian analysis. But the position I took then was that the determination of an alpha and beta were necessary. The specification was necessary as a guideline when you're designing the clinical trial in order to determine a sample size and in order to get a power. This was necessary and essential in order to be able to get started. But once you were started, and once you were monitoring data, which turned out to be a very essential part of a clinical trial, you had to have other rules govern. The alpha and beta may not have been that critical, and as a result, there were plans, theoretical plans, methodological plans. O'Brien Fleming,
Right.
Pocock rules for taking multiple looks over time, so that overall you would have some kind of control on a reasonable type 1 error. So that, to us, it seemed that this, at least I thought, that my position is still that way. We still use it as a guideline, but we still are relaxed when we look at data, which we no longer concerned about.
Well, many of your papers with Jerry at that time dealt with Bayesian approaches to the problem of sequential monitoring of data, whereas the later techniques that are pretty well come into vogue are frequentist-based, such as the O'Brien Fleming or the Pocock bounds or the alpha spending functions that we now use. Do you still think that there's a lot of merit to these Bayesian procedures?
There may be. As a matter of fact, isn't it true that the Bayesian procedures are now used very prevailingly in the so-called phase 1 clinical trials?
Oh, yes.
Phase 2
right.
clinical trials. And they're making a big contribution. There may be a difficulty in phase 3 clinical trials for clinicians accepting a prior, which may be to some extent arbitrary and not so arbitrary. However, the Bayesians would argue that that's not necessarily so. So I think that there may be some room for Bayesian stuff even in the future, but so far we are using frequentist theory.
I'm sure Joel would be glad to hear that.
Yes.
Let's see, when you were in the Child Health Institute, you had a chance to work with Dan Siegel, I recall, and he wrote a couple of very influential papers on the theory of epidemiologic methods, one on matching and another one on multivariate methods of analysis for case control studies. Could you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah. I think there were two things that you have mixed. The paired matching was with Cornfield, which was never published. That's the paper
Well,
you mean.
there was one
but
by
there was
Siegel and Greenhouse, too,
But
on
the Siegel
matching.
and Greenhouse papers, there were two.
Yeah.
One was to establish the validity of case control studies, period, whether it's matched or unmatched. And we did that by by brute force, by algebraic various assumptions leading to some rather complex algebra to point out the effects of various violations of assumptions on the estimates that one got from case control studies. The other one, however, was a real breakthrough, and I don't think has been sufficiently recognized as being new. That was the use of a logistic function in case control analysis. We pointed out that you can do the same thing you do in a regular cohort study for for the application of logistic procedures. The only thing you can't get is an absolute estimate of the intercept. Therefore, what you do is compare one vector of the x's with another vector of the x's, so you get a relative estimate of the risk compared to that baseline. Now, I believe I'm correct that Breslau pointed out that this was done by us, but from that point on, it's gotten away from us. There's not been sufficient recognition that this was one of the first applications of logistic regression in a case control study.
The ideas have been well worked out for the cohort study in previous years, but they really hadn't found their way into case control studies until about that time.
Right. And of course, then this was done by many people, mathematical statisticians in a more elaborate sense, so that ours got lost in the shuffle. Which leads me to remember something that you asked before. When we did the longitudinal analysis by looking at the parameters of a curve on an individual,
the NIH model,
we were among ourselves. I believe Seymour Geisler was the first one to look at us and say, this we'll call the NIH model. But we have never had this appear in the literature, except possibly Dave Demetz thinks he used it, and I have to get in touch with him. It's very strange, but people used it, investigators use it, they use it all the time while we were working with them, and maybe we could find an application in which it was used, and then we could refer back to that as saying that was the NIH model. I'm sorry to go back, but one thing recalls another, especially when you're 90 years old.
Now, related to this work, I can remember in the 70s, you and Jerry were very excited about a paper on matched case control studies, and you all were upset that it didn't get published. But what was the result, and whatever happened with that paper?
This paper was, I think, a magnificent paper. It had a lot of implications which keep cropping up now in other people's work. It was a paper where we assumed a matched design. There was a pair in which you randomized member to pair with treatment, member to pair the control. We assumed the probability for the treated member to have an event, a different probability for the control member to have an event, but we did postulate across n pairs that there was a constant odds ratio. Theta was constant. So if you notice, there will be np1s, np2s, and 1 theta, which is 2 p1 plus p2, 2n plus 1 parameters. Now, if you do the maximum likelihood estimate of theta in that particular problem, which you can do, you come up with an estimate of theta in a matched pair design, remember, of a square over b square. Now, this is the way we got together. I did this maximum likelihood estimate because I had never seen it done before, and I got a square over b square. Of course, they didn't believe it, because we know from McNemar's test it should be a over b, a being the off-diagonal elements, a and b being the off-diagonal elements.
The discordant pairs.
When I mentioned it at lunch sometime, Jerry said, yeah, there was a fellow who had a dissertation at Pittsburgh, I believe, who had got the same result. In fact, we have a reference to that in our paper. So Jerry went back, and he had gotten a over b and found that there was a mistake in the algebra and got also a square over b square. So then we got together and we tried to solve this problem. The first thing we did was to reduce the problem to put in theta for all of the p2s. So we had n plus 1 parameters. And then we had something very interesting happen. We were able to get estimates by this reduction for some of the things, but not for theta. And then we ran into the problem that Neyman and Betty Scott had observed, that when you have a nuisance parameter which goes to infinity, you get a biased estimate of the parameter you're interested in. So we get a biased estimate of theta. So then what we had to do was to postulate a distribution for those P1s. P2, I remember, was substituted for by P1 and theta. We got assumed a distribution we call the G of P1. We didn't have to postulate a specific. Now you can think of this as a distribution, a frequentist distribution, or you can think of this as a Bayesian distribution of a parameter.
Right.
But whatever it was, when you put this into the multiple integrals, you were able to divide the integrals for those who had a plus plus in the two members, a plus minus, minus plus, and minus minus. So you had 4 components which turned out to be a multinomial. And this multinomial, our problem was to find the reduction in the 4 parameters. We had to go to 4 parameters. Well, one was that it had to sum to n. That was easy. The other was we substituted for the NPs p bar. That was easy. The biggest problem, theta, of course, was theta. The biggest problem was the remaining parameter, which turned out to be the covariance between the P1s and the P2s. So this enabled us immediately, it struck us that this mention of the covariance enabled us to unify the whole field, because if the lambda, which had to be positive, then we had the A over B with maximized matched pair. If the lambda was 0, in other words, there was no relation between P1 and P2, then we're back to the old pooled estimate,
Right.
which was the pooled estimate of the theta from both groups. Now that paper was submitted to first the Royal Statistical Society, and was rejected, although David Cox, who was editor at the time, would have liked to have had the section 5, which gave the efficiency of the procedure when you use a multiple, the pooled estimate, when you're supposed to use the non-pooled estimate. At that time, we didn't go for that, so we then submitted to the Journal of American Statistical Association, and then we got rejected because somebody thought we made use of an incorrect use of Slutsky's theorem, which I later checked with Herman Chernoff, and he said that he thought it was a correct use. So that was 1979, and Jerry had died by that time, and I let this thing go. But I think I will revive it, and with Jerry's permission, I will put his name on a paper.
Well, it's interesting to hear that you and Jerry also have trouble publishing papers sometimes.
Oh yes, a lot of trouble.
Let's see. Of course, I enjoyed very much my course that I had with you here at GW
Yes,
in
I
multivariate
remember.
analysis. And John mentioned that you have an affiliation with GW stretching back to 1946, I guess.
Yes.
But just wonder if there are any particularly memorable aspects of your career at GW as an academician,
What was memorable is that I came on as a part-timer, of course, because I was working for the NIH already, full-time. What was memorable was that the importance of mathematical background for some of our students coming into statistics as majors, even then, was lacking a little bit. So Dr. Weider tried to make that up by saying, by not having these students go into the math department and learning theoretical, for example, linear algebra as bases for spaces, all they needed is a calculus of matrices, or going into a complex variable, because all they needed was integration over a complex domain. So he started teaching these courses in the statistics department, and the one he selected to teach him was myself. So I taught a course in the theory of function of real variable with a Russian author in English. It was Nathanson. And then I taught a course in complex variables with the old book by Curtis. And that was rather made for interesting things until the math department began to realize they were losing students to these courses, and they start modifying their courses, and we no longer teach these, as far as I know, in the statistics department. There were other things that happened that were memorable. Kovach and I, for example, we had a great relationship in doing this dissertation. Kovach once had me come over to his home in order to consider some problem that I had run into. And when I came in, his wife took me to the room where he was in. He was lying on his back. And I said, "Cully, this is no way to get some exercise. This is the best exercise in the world, is lying on your back and thinking up theorems. Yeah.
You had other collaborations at GW too.
Oh, yes. In later years, most recently, collaboration with Gasworth, Professor Gasworth, Joe Gasworth. Gasworth had a joint appointment in economics. His interest in application, by the way, is in law, but it was also in violations of the law in the firm, in industry, in terms of hiring, discrimination promotion. And when we would be talking, discussing statistics, I began to realize that many of his problems were similar to problems of medicine in terms of adverse effects, getting a failure, not being promoted. And we started wondering whether some of the epidemiologic methods that had been already derived in epidemiology and biostatistics could be used. And that's the way we got together. And we used the odds ratio bit, in which a referee said, why using odds ratio? Why don't you use a log odds ratio? And we said, because it was trouble enough to getting odds ratios to be understood by medical people. We didn't want to get involved with lawyers to have to log odds ratios as opposed to odds ratios. And that went over well. Of course, Gasworth published a 2-volume series, a 2-volume book on statistics in the law. We had 2 papers. One was where we considered a problem with a common odds ratio, which was almost similar to the thing we had with Caulfield. And the other was called the biostatistical concepts in statistics in the law, discrimination problems. And both were very highly successful, he tells me. Got lots of requests for reprints.
The methods for controlling confounding were a very important part of it.
Very important part of some of the issues that he had. What's amazing, what I learned from Gasworth, was his deep knowledge of law cases. Unbelievable the way he can quote these law cases. But furthermore, he also indicated there were many judges who had a quantitative sense, who were able to absorb these ideas and actually make decisions based on them. And there were other judges who this thing fell flat, didn't understand it at all.
Now, Sam, today in schools of public health, as you mentioned earlier, there are now programs in biostatistics. One can get a master's or a doctorate in biostatistics. For those who might aspire to be a biostatistician, or what do you think are the good or the important elements that lead to making a good biostatistician, and what advice would you offer for curriculum development for those of us who are involved in programs of biostatistics?
Well, let me tell you something that took place when I was visiting at Harvard, the year I was at Harvard in 81, 82. I had made a suggestion about the education of students in the biostatistics departments. First of all, I agree with Zellin all the way that there's got to be a basic underlay of statistics courses. Intermediate probability, there's got to be some introduction to mathematical statistics of some high order, not elementary stuff. And there's got to be some idea, I think, of stochastic processes. But then I had made a suggestion which some of the people thought was very good, others did not, at Harvard, that they should take at least 6 months of a student's training and put them into a laboratory. A laboratory that is a medical laboratory where people work with animals or with test tubes, and let them see how things go when you can control conditions as you desire, get some concept, some idea as to what can be relaxed and compromised and still come out with an approximately good answer, not necessarily the exact answer. Not that it means that if you control perfectly you come out with an exact answer, many instances you don't. But I think that that would have been a great aid. So that, to sum up, there should be a basic underlay of what we would call formal statistics courses, however taught, even if there's a Bayesian course. That's not the point. Right. It shouldn't be all biostatistics and epidemiology. Then, of course, is their usual program, and there should be some kind of relationship or some association with practice, either in consultation or working for 6 months in a laboratory and designing experiments and also analyzing data.
They do get a pretty good clinical trial experience in an environment like that, right?
Well,
but they don't
not-
get the laboratory experience. Is
They
that what
don't
you're
get the laboratory experience, and it's not necessarily true that they get a clinical trial experience, because many biostatistics, some biostatistics department are not involved themselves in clinical trials. They have outside peripheral groups, like in Hopkins. The biostatistics department itself, I don't think, is directly involved in clinical trials, but it's the consortium that is in the periphery of clinical trials. So that there isn't that much even in clinical trials, which, of course, they more likely get than they would get the training in the laboratory. The laboratory training for us at the NIH was absolutely superb. And that's, remember, most of us did not know statistics. We had some mathematics. We learned our statistics. We went to schools, and then we got our statistics as it derived in experience with consultation. Consultation is very important, which reminds me of something. The other visiting professorship at Stanford was notable in many ways. There were a lot of greats. I was across the, I took Lincoln Moses' place for the year because he went to London with Peter Armitage, I believe. I was sitting right across the street from Herman, right across the alley from Herman Chernoff. Manny Parson was there, Charles Stein was there. And then the next summer there was a NIH summer biostatistics session at Stanford. I came back and I taught 2 courses. Jerry came back. But Tukey was there. And Tukey was playing table tennis with a whole group of people, and I thought I'd take my turn. I don't know what his score was, but mine was 0. So I said, I'd like to try it again. So you know what he did to me? He changed to his left hand and played me with his left hand. My score was still 0. That's memorable in the year at Stanford. But at Stanford also, I had Brad Efron, who is now a very famous statistician, who has contributed many ideas, essentially the bootstrap, but more than bootstrap too. And he was in 2 of my classes, I think analysis of variance and a probability course I taught. And I had learned that he was a math major, I believe, or major in another field. And I had talked to him, telling him that I think he's making a mistake, that the possibilities for advancement, for contribution to science, is much better in statistics than it is in the other field he was in. Now, whether he can remember this or not, I remember it, so that I claim is the way Efron got into statistics.
Well, that's a major contribution.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. That's right. Now, over your career, biostatistical methodology has advanced greatly. What are your views on biostatistical methodology or statistical methodology today, and its impact that it's having on biostatistics as a profession?
It's a leading question which is going to get me into trouble with a lot of people. I'm somewhat disheartened because we are governed now by PhDs who come out with a lot of mathematical ideas, a lot of modeling, and it's now gotten to the point where they're even modeling things that you can't even observe. This thing is called latent variables. Have become a big play in methodologies and mathematical statistics. Now, I can understand its use, for example, in some instances where you don't have any, if you're trying to learn something from astronomy, you can't do experiments. You have certain observations. You can model and introduce as many variables as you want because you can't observe everything anyway. But when they get to the point where they're introducing latent variables in clinical trials, then it gets a little bit of a problem. And I think the idea of statistics being essentially the nature of data, the art and collection of data, and the information that data has for the investigator, which the statistician's responsibility is to determine and then extract that information in the most efficient way as possible, is being lost. And now what we see is education, not in that particular area, but in areas where I think it's peripheral. It's worthwhile. It's great things for training. I have nothing against it. But when it comes to make inroads into statistical inference, I become concerned.
Well, getting back to your comments earlier about curriculum, I guess you would argue that data analysis ought to be one of the prime tenets of any program in statistics.
Yes. Let me tell you something that happened many years ago with a very famous mathematical statistician. He published a paper in Science where he had a k/2 problem. But he didn't realize it was a k/2 problem. He analyzed it as a k/1 problem. So he did a chi-square, leaving out all of the contribution of chi-square in the second column. And Jerry actually wrote a paper, Jerry Cornfield wrote a paper to Science about this. So that this is necessary if you want to be a statistician. You could be a mathematician in statistics, and there's no problem. And we do a lot of modeling. Our very essence of assuming a normal distribution is a model. But there's more than that's going into modeling right now than just that, than just for data analysis.
Of course, you've had a wonderful career, and John described the fact that you'd received the Founders Award and are a fellow of many statistical societies. Do you have any advice in view of your experiences for the younger statistician coming along, or maybe for the person who might consider a career in statistics?
Oh yeah, I think it's a wonderful career. There are so many possibilities. It's so rich in terms of potential ways in which you can go. You can get into statistics as a profession. You can teach. You get into statistics as a profession for consulting. You can get into statistics as a profession for doing research in statistics proper. Now, of course, there's a lot of luck to where you get your first job. I think this is extremely important. You get your first job in an academic environment which you think is great, in a department where you're now going to have 1 year as a postdoc, and then you find nothing there for you, and then you're left in a trap. Well, on the other hand, there are a lot of research organizations where I think the contemporary view of potential is greatest. Research organizations like coordinating centers that do clinical trials. Clinical trials is another problem as to what may come up there. But I think people who are mathematically able should be encouraged to major and go into statistics proper. Once they overcome the idea of the concept which is so new to them of uncertainty, that an X is not an X, that an X can be a 1 or a 2 or a 3, then I think with probabilities of taking on those values, then I think that they would be ripe and they would enjoy a career in statistics. I feel very strongly that it's been good to all of us and will continue to be good to a lot of other people. They got to remember this: if they're in mathematics, a lot of the bachelor students in mathematics are dropping out to make money in computing. And that's where they'll be, in computing. Now, if they want to go ahead, then they have a choice to major in mathematics or major in statistics, or in operations research, for example, in engineering. They got to remember that the greatness can be assumed in either of those fields, but statistics should be considered equal to what is in mathematics. Now, statistics proper, I always like to point out, and I did once in an orientation to parents who were bringing their children, to their sons and daughters, to freshman orientation at George Washington. Mathematics may be the queen of the sciences, but statistics is the queen of the experimental sciences. And I got bawled out with that by a biologist who didn't like it. In fact, he happened to be chief of the biological sciences.
Did you have to cajole your son, Joel, to go into statistics?
No, as a matter of fact, I wanted him to go into medicine.
Is that so?
But the interviewer here at GW Medical School interviewed him and didn't accept him, so then he went into statistics, and I think he's very thankful for it now.
He's done a wonderful job.
Yes, thank you, thank you. I shall tell him that he appears in this interview.
Well, Sam and Mitch, I want to thank you for truly engaging discussion today. It's certainly been a pleasure for me to have known you all these years. And as we close, I understand you want to say a few words?
Thanks for what you just said. It's been a pleasure for me, and I'm still amazed. What I want to do is to thank the committee of the American Statistical Association for selecting me for this honor of being videoed. And I'd also like to thank George Washington University, particularly Bob Smythe, Department of Statistics, you as head of the Department of Biostatistics Center. And Mitch, thank you very much for coming out here, having to go through a fire drill and all of that stuff. Well, thank you both very much.
I've enjoyed it.
So.